Good day, everyone. This is the second episode of Her Voice, and today we are going to be tackling issues that Indigenous groups in the Philippines face today and why we should give them more spotlight in bringing peace and goodness in our society. To start off, according to the World Organization Against Torture, or the OMCT, in 2007, the Philippines has an estimated number of 140 indigenous ethno-linguistic groups in the country. This is about 10 to 20% of the Filipino population. There are various types of indigenous groups such as Bontoc and Ifugaos, known for building the rice terraces of Luzon, and other groups who practice hunter-gathering. To distinguish the indigenous groups by geographical distinction, in Luzon we have the Igorots, which is a Tagalog for mountaineer, and in Mindanao we have Lumads, which is translated into indigenous. And there are also collective names of Manobo, Mangyan, and many other names for those who live in either Luzon or Visayas. To give you guys a quick historical background on indigenous people and their fight for ancestral lands, during the Spanish colonial period, the Spanish claimed ownership of the Philippine Islands and gained authority to get rid of the land. Later on, during the American rule, U.S. authorities removed all of the land ownership rights that the Moro, Luma chiefs, and other indigenous leaders had without the consent of the government. Because of this, only individuals or corporations could claim and register for private land ownership, which left no space for ancestral land that Lumads held sacred. However, due to the efforts of the Lumads of Mindanao during the 1987 Constitution and Articles 5 and 7, there were laws and protection for indigenous cultural communities in relation to their ancestral lands. So these are promises of the state to protect the rights of indigenous people in preserving and developing their culture, tradition, and heritage. To add, there's also the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of 1997, which adopted a National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, also known as the NCIP. This offered an option for allowing Lumads to apply for a certificate of ancestral domain title. However, even with these certificates, land projects can still be executed if a certificate of free, prior, and informed consent, or what they call the FPIC, is obtained from affected indigenous communities. Sadly, there have been reports that indigenous people have been manipulated or threatened so that companies could receive FPICs, and some cases even led to murder. Thus, we can say that even with the existence of all these acts and constitutions, indigenous peoples here in our country are still one of the most marginalized groups in our society, and they are often victims of cases of abuse, violence, and exploitation. They are also at high risk, especially for children and women, to be involved with armed conflict, which makes them more vulnerable to both physical and sexual abuse. Thus, the indigenous organizations resist through protests to fight against commercial interest on ancestral lands. However, indigenous activists are also victims of human rights abuse despite wanting only to protect their economic, social, and cultural rights as a community. OMC states that the cause of poverty among indigenous people is connected to the issue of land use and the unequal distribution of benefits or goods from economic development. This is a lot to take in, and however, this is still an issue that we have to raise. And with the issue on the violence against indigenous people's rights, these are aspects that principles that affect and are highly related to the principles of Catholic social teaching, or the CST, in relation to the plight of indigenous groups. First and foremost, indigenous peoples are also human persons, and each person have the dignity of their own. As humans, we should be treated with respect, and we should also treat each other with respect. The different forms of abuse that our indigenous peoples have experienced over the past decades are clearly a sign of their human rights being violated and their dignity being taken away from them. Despite the existence of laws that aim and promise to protect their rights, they're still highly vulnerable to being manipulated and forced in surrendering their lands to commercial interests by companies that manage to exploit ancestral lands. These ancestral lands are considered as sacred to indigenous peoples, and they have been caring for the environment because they see it as part of their heritage. This is another principle that CST teaches us to be stewards of God's creation. This means that in violating their rights to claim and preserve ancestral lands, people are also violating God's purpose for us as humans to care for the earth as our home. For me, since laws alone are not enough to protect indigenous groups' rights, we must be able to convince more Filipinos to stand along with the minority groups for the good of each person. Fighting along with the plight of indigenous groups also promote the benefit of future generations as it is against exploitation of land and natural resources. Hence, the solution to further strengthening the safety of indigenous groups, all of us must collectively fight together. This is an act of solidarity and participation to create a better community for each person. We have to admit that a lot of us have the privilege to have our rights kept safe and protected. But unlike most minority groups, like indigenous people, they have to flee to cities just for people to hear their plea and to ask for help. Hence, as part of the majority groups, we have the privilege and the responsibility to be one with the plight of indigenous people here in our country. We should always remember to put into the highest priority the common good for everyone as CST teaches us. Even though we are all used to fast and abrupt development as we live in urban communities, development may seem right for most of us who have this lifestyle. However, we must not forget that there's a culture that must be preserved, and it will only happen if we respect their right to develop in their own ways and in their own pacing with their own methods. With that, I'd like to end this podcast by saying that today's episode is actually a call for participation to fight along with indigenous people's rights against all forms of abuse and exploitation. If you believe that this is an issue that must be heard by many more Filipinos, do share and spread this podcast to spread more awareness on the issues that affect minority groups like indigenous groups here in the Philippines. I hope to see you guys in the next episode of Her Voice.